Good morning. I'm such a TED head myself, and I guess that's why you all are here. So I'm just kind of drinking this in for a moment. So I am here today to talk about public school funding through the lens of our experience here in Fairfax County. And the juxtaposition here is probably noticeable. I've got a picture of really cute kids and violins and then a really dramatic title, right? Stepping back from the brink. Well, I hope by the end that I kind of pull that all together. The story of public school funding here in Fairfax County, as I think for a lot of places across the country, is really a tipping point story. And as Malcolm Gladwell has said, a tipping point is that magic moment when an idea, a trend, or a social behavior crosses a threshold, tips, and spreads like wildfire. Now, he makes it sound magical. It's almost Disney-like, right? But a tipping point can also be kind of a dangerous thing. And for those of us who care about public school funding, the magic moment that we face is that point where funding for a school system is so far behind the needs of the system that it will be more costly to recover the kind of schools we want than it would have been to maintain, if recovery is even possible. And that's true because of a basic economic feedback loop. We know that local economies and communities depend on the reputations of their school systems, right? So if you underfund schools to the point where the reputation starts to slip, the quality of the schools go bad, what happens then is that employers and families who can choose where to live will start settling in other places. The local economy suffers, property values suffer, and because public school funding is so reliant on local property taxes, as property values decrease, the revenues decrease, and there becomes this downward spiral that is increasingly hard to interrupt. And we here in Fairfax County, I believe we actually passed the tipping point a few years ago. And we've been living in this little bit of a no man's land where educators are doing more and more with less and less. So it's hard to make the case to the community that actually we're in danger. You know, nobody sees the measurable damage. So those of us who are paying attention and really care about the school system are accused of crying wolf and damaging the brand. Nobody wants the bad news, right? So it's a little bit of a game of chicken. I feel like, you don't know you've hit a tipping point until you're past it and there's some sort of measurable damage. So that's where we've been in Fairfax County, I believe, for the last 4 or 5 years. I'll come back to where we are now because the story does get better. But I want to take a quick look at public school funding nationally because I think it helps us understand a little bit of where we are today. But I want to start by saying that Fairfax County is relatively advantaged in this conversation. We are relatively well off. Our median household income is over $100,000 a year. We have a highly educated citizenry. We have access to the nation's capital. And we have many years of a national reputation for excellent schools. This is our Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology. It's our magnet math science school that is always in the top 2 or 3 high schools nationwide. So we have a lot to lose. That's the way I look at it. And I think as we look across the country, we probably should be looking for some cautionary tales. Recently, National Public Radio did a series on public school funding nationally, and it's a great series. I recommend it. I just borrowed a few of their resources here. This is a map of the United States, and what it shows is relative school funding per child, so how much each locality spends each year per child. And the orange and red areas are the areas that are spending less than the average. The turquoise to blue areas are spending more than the average. And I don't know if you can tell, but there's really only one state that you can pick out from even back there, and it's my home state of New York. That is the one state in the country, really, where, and they have other issues about education policy, but they are rocking school funding in New York. Not only are they at the top, they're at the top everywhere, and that's a big challenge. The United States, unlike every other developed nation, does not have one school system. We have a 50-state patchwork, and within each state, it's a patchwork, so that a child's zip code does, unfortunately, determine how well-funded and supported that child's public education will be. I'm going to show just a couple of illustrative slides from different parts of the country to show areas that are suffering from underfunding of their public schools. This is Sumter County, Alabama, so the rural South, population 13,000. I don't know how well you can see, but they are clearly struggling with underfunded public schools. And then we get to the urban North, Chicago, and they are also struggling, fighting over whether or not to close schools. So this is going on around the country, and polls also tell us that people understand that. A recent poll showed that 75% of Americans feel that teachers are underfunded, undervalued, underpaid. We know this is happening, right? We know that across the country, rural, urban, and increasingly suburban districts are suffering from underfunding of their public schools. To date, actually, 45 states, 45 out of 50, have been sued by local school districts or local governments for underfunding, inadequate or inequitable funding of public schools. So it's a problem. And you have to ask yourself, how did this happen? How did the United States become a place where we don't seem to care about funding public schools, when we know actually that it is an excellent investment to make? It seems irrational, even from the perspective of self-interest. Why wouldn't we do better? Some of the evidence that education is actually a really excellent investment. Prisons are a lot more expensive than schools. The more you learn, the more you earn. We know this. Data is always showing us this. Even the amount of money that we spend on pre-K pays back many times over in the life of a child. It's a wonderful investment. The earlier we make it, the better it is. And also studies have shown that, well, if the more you learn, the more you earn is true locally, then overall in the United States, we can improve our GDP by as much as 14% if we would just make that investment in public schools. So why? If it's irrational, why aren't we doing it? If it would be rational to do it, why aren't we doing it? And I have some theories. I think beyond the natural the resistance that people have to paying more in taxes, I think there's more going on. I think there are 3 extraordinary pressures today on public schools and on public school funding in the country. So the 3 extraordinary pressures on public schools today. The first is the legacy of No Child Left Behind. This is a quote from the United States Department of Education, where, in No Child Left Behind, we took the good idea of accountability and we turned it into a no-win, test and punish system for public schools. It just churns out bad news about schools all the time. This quote from the Department of Education, where they describe schools as dropout factories, and they talk about how the schools themselves are responsible for the problems in the communities around them. I mean, it's tough enough for schools to meet the educational needs of students that come from challenging environments, but this is suggesting that the schools themselves are responsible for underemployment, stagnating wages, substandard housing, food deserts, poverty, crime. I mean, what does this say? This says that public schools, bad teachers are what's wrong with this country. And that, unfortunately, has been a steady message coming out of the accountability movement for the last 10 to 15 years. Another challenge facing school funding and school systems these days is the general anti-public sector movement that you see. This is drinking water from Flint, Michigan. And if safe drinking, this is tap water, if safe drinking water is no longer considered part of the public trust, right? No longer considered something that we collectively feel is our responsibility, then what hope do public schools and teachers have? And then this is actually a scene from the Wisconsin State House a few years ago. Wisconsin, one of our states that has a long history of supporting workers and unions, well, their public employees have been under so much pressure that actually they're still in court. And a few years ago, they took over the State House. And what are they fighting for? They're fighting for a living wage. They're fighting for a secure and dignified retirement in exchange for the investment that they've made in their communities through a lifetime of public service. But they're considered the problem. And the third thing I think that is putting a lot of pressure on school systems is the growing income gap between the rich and the poor. For the first time in 50 years, a majority of United States public school students are living in poverty. And what that does is it exacerbates a situation that we've had for a while that is getting worse, where increasingly you have schools that have high populations of students living in poverty in communities that cannot afford to support those schools. And we know that affluent families have always chosen either private schools or the more affluent suburban school districts. Well, anymore, they're also choosing the more affluent neighborhoods within those more affluent suburban districts. And so it's a concentration that is harder and harder for school systems to handle, and that's true actually here in Fairfax County as well. So these are the pressures, right? And this is the constant narrative that we have had over the last 10 to 20 years of undeserving teachers, undeserving schools, undeserving communities, and it makes it that much easier for those, who resist paying taxes to say, well, the schools aren't worth it, they're not doing their job, right? So I want to bring it back to Fairfax County. We have been dealing with some of these pressures ourselves here. As I say, we are relatively advantaged, but some of these voices are here in Fairfax County as well. So let's go back here to Fairfax County to just about a year ago today. The school system received the 8th consecutive year of bad budget news, where the revenues coming in did not meet the growing needs. And after years of revenues not meeting needs, we are at a point where we are spending $1,000 less per child in real dollars than we were in 2008. It's not sustainable. We've done that by freezing teacher pay and raising class sizes. And we were at a point, we realized that if we had even one more bad year, we were going to have to cut important curricular and extracurricular programs for kids. We just couldn't manage even one more bad year. So the superintendent and the school board, we looked at each other and we thought, well, we have to get the community involved in this conversation. This is the community's school system. We need to let them know what's going on. It's going to be hard. We have to have an honest conversation. And so we did. We started talking about what was at risk for the school system. And as it happens, last year was an election year, and school boards in Virginia cannot raise revenue. So we had to put our political counterparts at the state and local government on the spot publicly. So we were not popular, but we knew we had to do it. And so the school board and the superintendent provided the information and the opportunity for the community to get involved, and just hoped, really, I found myself hoping, well, I hope the community lets us know that they do care about their schools and that they are willing to reinvest in their school system. It's one of the frustrations as an advocate, where you feel like you have to give your elected representative political cover to do what is just the right thing to do. But the truth is, taxes, it's hard to raise taxes. That is a community conversation and a community decision. So fortunately, the community rose up. The community completely rose to the challenge here. And this is a shot from a rally that the advocates held at the government center. And I don't know if you can see there, but there were kids playing violins and singing and talking about foreign language and sports and all the great programs that make us here in Fairfax County who we are. They're the programs that bring people literally from all over the world to this school system, that make us successful, keep our reputation where we want it to be. So this grassroots army of advocates, most of them busy working parents, organized thousands of emails and letters and phone calls and rallies and testified, and they gave our elected representatives at the state and local level the message: we want to reinvest in our schools. We do. And they were successful. The community was successful. Last month, we heard from our local funders here on the Board of Supervisors, and we had earlier gotten good news from the state that the school system now, for the next school year, will have not only the revenue that we need to meet rising costs and enrollments, but we actually have the revenue that we need to make some reinvestments, to recover some of the ground that we've lost, to bring our teacher salaries up halfway to market average. We've gotten so low that we can only get halfway this year, and to cap elementary school class sizes. So hopefully we won't continue to lose teachers to surrounding districts where they can make $15,000 more a year. Where we won't continue to lose families who look at an elementary class size of over 30 and think, well, I'll go somewhere else with my kids. So we will be able to make those investments. We'll be able to start stepping back from the edge, stepping back toward the tipping point. I think we're still probably teetering there, and it will take a couple of years to really get back to where we want to be, to feel safely like we have the school system that we want to have here. But it's been a great victory year, I think. And the big win is that we now have a common understanding of what we care about and what we want to invest in as a community. And that in itself is huge. So did we win one for the kids? Yes, absolutely we did. But I think we won one for each other and for ourselves and for our communities as well. Because as our schools prosper and make progress, so do we as a community. And isn't that the tipping point we want? So, thank you.